The chamber was the size of a moon. Not a small moon, either. The Galactic Council's great meeting hall had been carved out of a hollowed asteroid, reinforced with dreth alloy, and lined with seats that curved upward in concentric rings until they disappeared into the artificial clouds above. Every seat was filled. 512 species, each represented by their finest diplomat, their sharpest mind, their most decorated speaker. They had gathered to debate the Vorkai War, a conflict that had been burning across 3-star systems for 11 years, swallowing fleets, colonies, and entire civilizations in its fire. Nobody had invited humanity. Commander Yara Ose found out about the meeting the same way most humans found out about things the Council didn't want them to know, through a Grellian merchant who had been bribed with a case of single-malt Scotch whiskey and 2 bags of ground coffee. The Grellians had no defense against either substance, and the merchant had talked for 6 hours straight before passing out across a landing bay cargo crate. Yara had listened to every word. She stood now at the entrance to the Great Hall, wearing her Earth Defense Coalition uniform, dark gray, slightly wrinkled from the long transit, with a small coffee stain near the left breast pocket that she'd failed to remove despite 3 attempts. She carried no weapons. She had no invitation. She had a datapad, a stylus, and an idea that had kept her awake for the last 40 hours. The Drek guard at the entrance was 4 meters tall and had 6 arms, each holding a different type of stopping device. It looked down at Yara with all 4 of its primary eyes and made a sound like a building settling. "This session is closed," the translation matrix said in her earpiece. "Unauthorized biological units are not permitted." "I'm not unauthorized," Yara said. She pulled out a slim card and held it up. "I'm the EDC liaison for Sector 7. This is my sector credential." The guard looked at the card. The card was real. The credential was also real, technically. What it did not specify was that Sector 7's liaison role had never been formally recognized by the Council, because the Council had never formally recognized humanity's right to a liaison role in the first place. But the card said Sector 7. The chamber was in Sector 7. The guard had been given a list of who was not allowed in, and the list did not include Sector 7 liaisons because nobody had thought to write that down. Bureaucratic gaps, Yara thought as the door opened. The galaxy runs on them. The moment she stepped inside, the noise of 512 species in conversation hit her like a wall. It smelled like ozone, salt water, something burnt, and what she had learned to identify as the particular scent of Velthari anxiety, a sharp, metallic sweetness that the species produced involuntarily when stressed. There were a lot of stressed Velthari in the room. She found an empty observer seat near the back, a section technically reserved for approved media liaisons, which again, was not a category the guard had been briefed to exclude humans from, and sat down. She pulled out her datapad and started taking notes. The debate had been running for 6 hours already. The core argument was simple. The Vorkai, a silicon-based predator species with a hunger for deuterium-rich planetary cores, had begun expanding their war front in ways that were becoming mathematically unpredictable. 3 council-member civilizations had already lost colony worlds. The Hethany Collective had lost an entire generation ship. The debate in the chamber was about whether the council should commit to a unified military response, a diplomatic channel, or a strategic withdrawal and containment line. Every argument was smart. Every counter-argument was smarter. The Council had brilliant minds from 500 civilizations applying 500 different frameworks to a problem that had been studied for 11 years, and they had produced exactly nothing actionable. Because the real problem, the thing nobody in that chamber was saying out loud, was that they were all afraid. Not of the Vorkai's weapons or their fleet strength. They were afraid of the cost. Every civilization at that table had done the math and calculated what a full war commitment would mean for their own people, their own resources, their own futures. And every one of them had quietly decided that the cost was something they would rather someone else paid first. Yara had read the full intelligence briefing on the Vorkai 17 times during the transit here. She had also read the Council's own archived strategic assessments, 3 independent academic analyses from Tertiary University, and a surprisingly useful operational breakdown written by a retired Grellian fleet commander who had fought the Vorkai in the early years of the conflict. She had made notes in the margins of all of them. Her datapad was full of those notes. She raised her hand. Nobody noticed. She stood up. A few heads, and things that were not quite heads but served the same function turned her way. A Velthari diplomat 3 rows down made the sound that meant extreme confusion. One of the Hethany representatives blinked its membrane eyes rapidly, which in their species meant something between surprise and alarm. The council speaker, a tall Drek elder named Vashektar, looked down from the central podium. Its 4 eyes focused on Yara with the slow precision of a creature that had been leading meetings for 300 years and had seen everything, or believed it had. "This session is closed to non-council species," Vashektar said, its voice carrying perfectly through the acoustic engineering of the chamber. "With respect," Yara said, and her translation matrix carried her voice back up to the podium just as clearly. "I'm not here as a non-council species. I'm here as the EDC Sector 7 liaison. Humanity has no formal status before this council." "Humanity has no formal status," Yara agreed pleasantly. "But Sector 7 has formal status. And I am the Sector 7 liaison." The credential was verified at the door. A ripple moved through the chamber. Not physical, a social ripple, the kind that happened when 500 intelligent species simultaneously processed the same uncomfortable realization. The credential had been verified. The door had opened. The guard had followed procedure. And procedure had a gap in it that was now standing in the back row holding a slightly coffee-stained uniform and a datapad full of margin notes. Vashektar was quiet for 4 seconds. In a being that old, for seconds of silence meant a great deal of thinking was happening. "You may observe," it said finally. "You may not address the chamber." "Of course," Yara said, and sat back down. She spent the next 2 hours listening. She did not raise her hand again. She watched the debates cycle through the same positions, the same fears, the same mathematical dead ends. She watched the Hethany delegates go very still every time the Vorkai's expansion rate was discussed, the stillness of beings who had lost too much and were calculating whether they could afford to lose more. She watched the tertiary bloc argue for containment with the polished smoothness of people who had prepared their argument before the session began and were not really listening to anyone else. She watched the Grelian representatives, who she knew were personally furious but were being politically careful, and who kept casting quick looks at the tertiary when they thought nobody was watching. She wrote all of it down. At the end of the second hour, the session broke for a rest interval. Delegates filed out through various exits suited to their biology. Yara stayed in her seat and kept writing. When Vashektar passed the observer section on its way to the speaker's anteroom, it paused. "You have been taking notes for 2 hours, it said. "Yes," Yara said. "What could a human possibly find worth noting that 500 council species have not already analyzed?" Yara looked up from her datapad. She smiled. Not the diplomatic smile she had practiced, but the real one, the one that meant she had found the thing everyone else had missed. "The thing none of you are saying," she said. Vashektar's 4 eyes looked at her for a long moment. "The session resumes in 20 minutes, it said. "I know," Yara said. "I'll be ready." The session resumed with the same structured chaos as before. Delegates returned to their seats, translators recalibrated, and Vashektar took the podium again with the weight of someone carrying a problem that had not gotten lighter during the break. The tertiary bloc resumed their containment argument from exactly where they had left it, as if the pause had simply been a breath mid-sentence. The Hethany sat in the same stillness. The Grelians exchanged quiet looks that Yara had now learned to read as deep frustration wearing a polite mask. She was no longer in the observer section. Nobody had officially moved her. But during the break, a junior Velthari administrative aide had appeared at her elbow with an expression of profound bureaucratic uncertainty and explained that the speaker had determined that, as the Sector 7 liaison, she was technically eligible for a secondary floor seat, a small pull-out position near the edge of the main delegate ring, used historically for affiliated parties with observational status. The aide had then led her to it before anyone could formally object, moving with the speed of someone who had been told to do something confusing and wanted to complete it before anyone stopped them. Yara settled into the secondary seat, put her data pad on the small surface that folded out from the armrest, and waited. The tertiary speaker, a lean, silver-scaled diplomat named Ethan Var, was making the containment case again. The argument was technically sound. A defensive perimeter along the Kareth line, supported by a joint fleet drawn from 16 council species, would halt Vorkai expansion at its current front and give the council time to develop a longer-term strategy. The cost would be distributed across the coalition. No single species would bear the full weight. It was a clean, logical argument. It was also, Yara had determined after 40 hours of reading, completely wrong. She raised her stylus. Not her hand. Her stylus. Tip up. A gesture she had observed the Grelian delegates using twice during the morning session to signal a secondary point. She had no idea if it meant the same thing to the Drek speaker as it did to the Grelians. But Voshektar's upper right eye tracked to her, and that was enough. The secondary Sector 7 liaison has indicated a point, Voshektar said. The chamber noise dropped by about a third, which in a room of 500 species still left considerable ambient sound. Ethanvar stopped mid-sentence and turned its silver head toward Yara with an expression that translated, across significant biological difference, as irritation. The floor recognizes Sector 7, Voshektar said. Briefly, Yara stood. She didn't rush. Rushing, she had found, made people trust you less. She let the room settle a little more before she spoke. The Kareth Line proposal assumes the Vorkai are expanding for resource acquisition, she said. That's the foundation the entire containment model is built on. They need deuterium-rich cores. Their consumption rate has been mapped. Their expansion follows a predictable resource gradient. Contain the front, deny access to new systems, and eventually they either negotiate or exhaust their current reserves. She paused. That model worked for the first 4 years of the conflict. It stopped working in year 5. I'd like to know if anyone in this chamber has asked why. The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence before. It was the silence of rooms where something has been said that people already knew but had been carefully not saying. Ethanvar recovered first. The shift in Vorkai behavior in year 5 has been extensively analyzed. Their tactical adaptation was within expected parameters for a species of their intelligence class. Their tactical adaptation was, Yara agreed. Their resource targeting wasn't. In year 4, they were hitting deuterium-rich systems in a logical gradient. Highest concentration first, then stepping down. In year 5, they started hitting systems that were lower on the gradient while skipping richer ones. And in years 6 through 11, that pattern has continued and actually accelerated. She turned her datapad around so the nearest delegates could see the chart she'd compiled, knowing they almost certainly couldn't read it from that distance, but that the gesture of showing data was culturally legible across most of the species in the room. That's not resource acquisition behavior. That's not even strategic behavior in the way the containment model defines it. That's something else. And what do you believe it is? The question came not from Ethanvar, but from the Hethany section. The delegate who had spoken was older, its membrane eyes darker than the others, and it asked the question in the flat tone of someone who had been thinking the same thing for a long time and wanted to hear someone else say it first. I think the Vorkai hit your generation ship on purpose, Yara said, looking at the Hethany delegate directly. Not because it was a high-value resource target. It wasn't. Generation ships run lean on deuterium. Everyone knows that. They hit it because it was a symbol. Because losing a generation ship is the kind of loss that breaks the will of a civilization to fight. And I think they've been making that calculation, psychological impact over resource value, for the last 6 years, while this council built a containment model based on a resource acquisition framework that the Vorkai quietly abandoned. The chamber was very quiet now. The Hethany delegate sat completely still for a long moment. Then it made a sound that the translation matrix rendered only partially, something between grief and recognition. Continue, said Voshektar. Yara had not expected to be told to continue. She had expected to be thanked for her input and gently redirected to the observer section. She looked at her notes. If the Vorkai are fighting a psychological war rather than a resource war, then the Kareth line doesn't just fail to solve the problem. It actively makes it worse. A defensive perimeter tells them the strategy is working. They'll push against it not to break through for resources, but to make the cost of holding it unbearable. They'll target the species contributing the least to the coalition, the ones whose populations are most sensitive to losses, and they'll apply pressure precisely where the coalition is most likely to fracture. She looked toward the tertiary block. I mean, no disrespect to the proposal. It's the right answer to the wrong question. Ethanvar's scales had changed color slightly. Yara had read enough about tertiary biology to know that was not a good sign socially. But she had also read enough about the Vorkai to know this was not the moment to be diplomatic about difficult facts. If you believe the question is wrong, Ethan Var said carefully, then perhaps you have identified the correct question. I have a few ideas about that, Yara said. This is highly irregular, said a voice from the Prothean block. A species Yara had not interacted with before, blue-skinned and multi-limbed, with a reputation for procedural rigidity. A human has no standing to reframe the strategic discussion of this council. A human has said something none of the rest of us said. The Hethany delegate replied quietly. That seems relevant regardless of standing. Vosektar held up one of its 6 hands. The room settled. Sector 7 liaison. It said, looking at Yara with all 4 eyes in a way that felt like being studied rather than addressed. You have identified what you believe is a flaw in the foundational analysis. Do you have a proposed correction? This was the moment. Yara had mapped it out during the 40 hours of preparation. She had known that if she got this far, this would be the question. Not what's wrong with the plan, but what's the alternative? Because identifying problems was easy. Everyone in this room was smart enough to identify problems. What the council needed, what it had not been able to produce in 11 years, was something that looked like an answer. She had an answer. It was incomplete, it was risky, and it depended on something she hadn't told them yet. Yes, she said. But it requires something from this council that the council has not previously been willing to give. Voshektar's expression was unreadable. Name it. Yara took a breath. You need to formally recognize humanity as a member species. Full council status. Not observer, not liaison, not affiliated party. Full member, with a seat at this table. The noise that followed was considerable. The noise lasted a long time. Not panic. 500 civilizations at the peak of their diplomatic development didn't panic easily, but something close to collective disbelief. The sound of hundreds of species processing the same audacious demand in their own way, through their own cultural filters, and arriving at variations of the same reaction. She cannot be serious. Voshektar let it run for 30 seconds before raising its hand again. 30 seconds in a room of 500 species was generous. It was also deliberate. Yara understood that the speaker was letting the room express itself before calling it to order, because the alternative was suppressing the reaction and letting it fester into something harder to manage. She stayed standing. She had thought carefully about this. Sitting down would look like retreat. Moving around would look like nervousness. Standing still, with her datapad in her hand and her expression calm, was the right thing to do while 500,000 civilizations decided what to think about her. Ethan Var was the first to speak once order returned. Humanity has been in interstellar contact for less than 100 years. Full council membership requires a minimum of 300 years of documented interstellar civilization, peer-reviewed cultural stability assessments, and sponsorship from no fewer than 5 existing member species. You meet none of these criteria. I know, Yara said. And I'm not asking the council to ignore those criteria. I'm asking the council to use the emergency provision in the founding compact. Another silence. This one had a different texture, sharper, more focused. Yara had found the emergency provision during her first reading of the council's full charter, which was publicly accessible to any species that knew it existed and knew where to look, which was information available in the same archive that held the Grellian fleet commander's operational breakdown. The provision had been written into the compact at the council's founding, over 2,000 years ago, by the original 12 species. It had never been used. It existed for a specific scenario, when the council faced an existential threat that could not be addressed by existing member species alone. A non-member species could be granted emergency, full membership by unanimous vote of the speakers panel, bypassing the standard criteria. The emergency provision required the threat to be formally declared existential. It required the unanimous vote, and it required the petitioning species to demonstrate a specific capability that no current member possessed. The founding compact's emergency membership clause, Voshektar said slowly, requires demonstration of a unique capability. Yes, Yara said. What capability does humanity claim to possess that 512 member species do not? This was the second moment. The first had been naming her condition. The second was delivering what she had come here to deliver. Yara set her datapad on the fold-out surface and pulled up a secondary file. Not the chart she'd shown before, but a set of coordinates and a timestamp. 4 months ago, she said, an EDC scout vessel made first contact with a Vorkai fleet commander in the Deleth corridor. Not combat contact. Diplomatic contact. We spoke to them. She let that settle. For 6 hours. Without a weapon fired on either side. The silence this time was total. Not quiet, total. The ambient hum of the chamber's systems, the distant atmospheric processors, the subtle vibrations of a structure built inside an asteroid. All of it seemed to drop away. 500 species sat in something close to genuine shock. That is not possible, Ifanvar said. It was not a challenge. It sounded like a person saying something they needed to hear refuted. We have the full recording, Yara said. 63 hours of footage across multiple sessions. The EDC has been in intermittent communication with this fleet commander. Their designation translates roughly as Fleet Mind Kethvoris for 4 months. We don't have a peace agreement. We don't have a ceasefire. But we have something this council has never had in 11 years of conflict. A conversation, the Hethany delegate said quietly. A conversation, Yara confirmed. The Preethian delegate who had objected before spoke again, but with less certainty in its voice. How? Every contact attempt by council species has resulted in immediate hostile response. The Vorkai have never indicated any capacity for diplomatic engagement. The Vorkai have never indicated it to anyone who was already at war with them, Yara said. Humanity isn't at war with the Vorkai. We were never part of the original conflict. We have no colony worlds in the contested systems, no deuterium installations they've targeted, no losses that have put us on the opposing side of a line in their minds. When our scout vessel appeared in the Deleth corridor, we weren't an enemy. We were something they had no category for. She paused. It turns out the Vorkai do have a category for species they haven't fought yet. It's not a peace category, exactly, but it's a talking category, and we fit in it. Vosektar had not moved in several minutes. When it spoke, its voice was careful. You are proposing that humanity serve as an intermediary. I'm proposing that humanity join the war, Yara said, on terms that no other council species can currently offer. We join as full members. We bring our diplomatic channel with Kethvoris. We bring the 63 hours of recorded communication data, which includes things the Vorkai have said about their own strategy, their own internal politics, and what they actually want from this conflict, which is not, based on everything they've told us, what the Council's analysis says it is. She looked around the chamber. And we fight, if it comes to fighting. We're not asking for protection. We're asking for a seat so we can do the thing none of you have been able to do. And if we refuse the membership? Ifanvar asked. Then we continue our independent diplomatic channel. We share nothing with the Council. We pursue whatever outcome we can reach bilaterally. And the Council continues its 11-year cycle of brilliant arguments that produce no action. She said it without hostility. It was simply a description of what would happen. I'd rather not do it that way. I think the Vorkai situation is genuinely dangerous. I think the psychological warfare model I described is going to fracture this coalition within 2 years if nothing changes, and I think a unified response, including humanity, is the best chance this galaxy has. But I need the seat to make that happen. Without it, I'm an unauthorized biological unit with a coffee stain on her uniform. The Hethany delegate made a sound that the translation matrix identified as laughter. It was a small, exhausted sound, but it was real. Vosektar looked at Yara for a long time. Then it turned to the chamber. The speakers panel will convene. All delegates are requested to remain available. It paused. The Sector 7 liaison is requested to remain as well. Of course, Yara said, and finally sat down. The panel convened in a side chamber that Yara was not invited into. She sat in her secondary seat and waited, watching the delegates move in their small groups, the political geometry of the chamber rearranging itself around the thing she had said. The Hethany delegation came to her twice. Once to ask a specific technical question about the Deleth corridor contact, once just to sit nearby in silence, which she understood was a significant gesture from a species that had lost what they had lost. The Grelian representatives sent over a small container of something warm that turned out to be a beverage she couldn't identify, but that tasted like strong tea and burned pleasantly on the way down. She drank it slowly and watched the room and thought about what came next. The speakers panel was in there deciding whether a species that had been spacefaring for less than a century was worth 11 years of pride and procedure. They were deciding whether one human's argument, one woman's 40 hours of reading and one nation's 4 months of accidental diplomacy was worth rewriting the rules that 500 civilizations had lived under for 2,000 years. She thought they would say yes, not because she had been persuasive, though she hoped she had been, but because the thing she had shown them was real, and the thing she had identified was real, and the council had been in the room with a problem for 11 years that had no solution until 20 minutes ago, when a person in a wrinkled uniform with a coffee stain on it had stood up and said the quiet part out loud. The panel chamber door opened after 2 hours and 40 minutes. Vas Hector walked back to the podium. The speaker's panel has reached a determination, it said. The panel had voted 6-1 in favor of invoking the emergency provision. Vas Hector announced it with the same measured cadence it used for everything. But Yara had been watching the speaker for hours now, and she caught the slight shift in posture that she was fairly certain indicated something the Drek experienced instead of relief. The one dissenting vote had been the Prethean representative on the panel, which surprised no one. The Prethians had opposed humanity's expansion into the outer sectors, opposed humanity's application for observer status 8 years ago, and generally opposed humanity's existence in the galactic community on procedural grounds at every opportunity. They were not malicious about it. They were simply a species that had been maintaining the rules for long enough that they had become, in some deep way, indistinguishable from the rules themselves. The full chamber vote was required next. Emergency membership under the Founding Compact's provision needed unanimous agreement from the speaker's panel, achieved, plus a simple majority of the full chamber. Vas Hector called it immediately, before the political temperature of the room could cool. The tally ran for 11 minutes. In a chamber of 512 species, voting through the translation and authentication matrices took time. Yara watched the numbers on the secondary screen beside the podium without blinking. She had been awake for over 40 hours. Her coffee had run out 6 hours ago. Her legs ached from standing. She watched the numbers anyway. The final count was 407 in favor, 61 against, 44 abstaining. It was not close. Vas Hector turned to look at her from the podium, and this time there was something in all 4 of its eyes that she could not quite name. The expression of a being that had seen a great deal of history and had just watched a small, additional piece of it happen in front of it. By the authority of the emergency provision of the Founding Compact, and by the majority vote of this chamber, it said, the species known as humanity, represented before this council by Commander Yara Say of the Earth Defense Coalition, is hereby granted full emergency membership status in the Galactic Council. All rights and responsibilities thereof apply immediately and without qualification. The chamber did not erupt. It absorbed. There was a sound, not applause, because most of the species present did not applaud, but a collective exhalation, a murmur, a shift in the acoustic texture of the room that meant 500 civilizations had just processed something significant and were still processing it. The Hethany delegates were very still. The Grellians made a sound between themselves that their translation matrices were not transmitting outward, a private communication, and then the nearest one looked at Yara and inclined its head in a gesture she recognized as genuine respect. Yara stood up. She smoothed the front of her uniform without thinking about it, and then stopped herself, because smoothing her uniform was not going to remove the coffee stain and was not going to change anything about this moment, and the moment did not need to be changed. Thank you, she said. Vas Hector descended from the podium. This was unusual. In the hours she had watched the speaker, it had not left the podium during session. It walked the length of the chamber floor and stopped in front of her secondary seat. Up close, it was even larger than it appeared from a distance, and the smell of it was like deep mineral water and something electric. You will need to notify your government, it said. I already drafted the message during the panel deliberation, Yara said. I had a feeling. You had a plan, Vas Hector said. It was not an accusation. It was closer to admiration. If Drek were capable of admiration, which the literature suggested they were, just expressed differently than most species expected. I had a plan and a backup plan and a backup to the backup, Yara said. The door credential was the backup to the backup. I was hoping I wouldn't need it. And the coffee stain? Yara looked down at it. That was just breakfast. The Drek speaker made a sound she had not heard it make before. After a moment she identified it, because she had read the Drek Behavioral Index twice during the transit and once during the panel deliberation, It was laughter. The next 72 hours were dense. Yara's message reached Earth, and the EDC response came back in pieces. First shock, then frantic verification queries, then a cascade of senior officials asking if she had genuinely just gotten humanity a council seat by walking through a door and giving a speech. She confirmed that this was essentially accurate and asked for a formal ratification of her actions and a team of actual diplomats, linguists, and Vorkai communication specialists to be dispatched to the council station immediately. The ratification came in 4 hours. The team was authorized in 6. Humans, it turned out, were capable of moving very fast when the alternative was losing the thing they had just accidentally won. In parallel, she began the process of delivering what she had promised. The 63 hours of Deleth corridor recordings were transferred to council archivists under a data-sharing protocol that she negotiated in a single session with a Velthari legal expert, who had initially presented her with a standard treaty framework 40 pages long, and who had looked increasingly alarmed as Yara worked through it in real time, made targeted changes, and handed it back in 40 minutes. The Velthari legal expert had told a colleague afterward, in a private communication that was later shared widely, that working with the human had been like watching someone assemble a complex machine while simultaneously redesigning it. Fleetmind Kethvoras was contacted and informed of the change in humanity's status. There was a pause of 11 hours before the Vorkai responded, which Yara had learned was normal for Kethvoras. The Fleetmind processed significant information slowly and responded only when it had completed that processing. When the response came, it was 6 words in the Vorkai language that translated as, "Your council speaks through you now?" Yara sent back 3 words, "Yes." Still listening. The Vorkai's response to that was immediate, which in her experience with Kethvoras was itself significant. Then we continue. She passed the exchange to Voshektar personally. The speaker read it twice, which she had also learned was unusual. The Drek typically processed written information in a single pass. "They respect you," Voshektar said. "They respect that we weren't part of the original conflict and that we haven't lied to them yet," Yara said. "That's a fragile thing. We need to build something real before it breaks. And you believe something real can be built." Yara thought about the 63 hours of recordings. She thought about the things Kethvoras had said in Session 4, when the Fleetmind had described, for the first time in 11 years of war, to any council-adjacent species, what the Vorkai actually needed. Not the resource targets, not the strategic objectives, the actual underlying need that had started the conflict, that the Council's frameworks had never identified because the frameworks were built on assumptions that had been wrong from the beginning. "I think the Vorkai started this war because they believed the Council would erase them," she said. "Not militarily, culturally. They saw the Council's expansion patterns, the standardization pressure on member species, the way smaller civilizations get absorbed into the Council framework and lose the things that made them distinct. And they made a preemptive choice. They decided that if they were going to be destroyed, they would make the destruction cost something first." Voshektar was very still. "That is an extraordinary claim," it said. Session 4, timestamp 9 hours 42 minutes, Yara said. Kethvoras uses a word that our linguist initially translated as territory, and then revised to existence boundary, and then eventually settled on the space a people need to remain themselves. They've been defending that. Not deuterium deposits. Not planetary cores. That. And if this is true, Voshektar said slowly, then the war is not a resource conflict or a territorial expansion. It is a species terrified of disappearing, Yara said, fighting the only way they knew how to be taken seriously. The speaker was quiet for a long time. Outside the chamber, the council station hummed around them. 500 species and their needs, and their histories, and their fears, all held together in this hollowed asteroid at the edge of 3-star systems that had been burning for 11 years. "What do you need?" Voshektar asked. "Time," Yara said. "A formal negotiation mandate from the Council. A commitment that if we reach a framework with Kethvoras, the Council will honor it, including whatever protections the Vorkai need to believe they won't be absorbed." She paused. "And probably more coffee." The Drek speaker made the sound again. The laughter. "The mandate will be drafted," it said. "The commitment I cannot make alone. It will require the chamber." "I know. I can address the chamber again." "Yes," Voshektar said. "I believe you can." Yara sent her second message to Earth that evening. It was shorter than the first. It said, "Asterisk, we have the seat. We have the channel. We have the beginning of an answer. Send the team fast. I've started something I need help finishing. Also, please send coffee. A lot of it. The Vorkai situation is going to take a while, but for the first time in 11 years, there's actually a table to sit at. We put it there. Humanity's in the war now, not with weapons, not yet, maybe not ever, but in the way that actually matters. We showed up, we listened, and we said the thing nobody else would say. Turns out that's enough to change everything." Asterisk, she pressed send and leaned back in her chair, in the small quarters she had been assigned on the council station. Simple, functional, still smelling faintly of the previous occupant's biology, and let herself be tired for the first time in 2 days. Outside her narrow viewport, 3-star systems hung in the black, burning with a war that was 11 years old and might, if she did her job right, finally be approaching something that looked like an end. One human had walked through a bureaucratic gap in a door and spoken the truth in a room full of brilliant minds who had been too afraid to say it themselves. She hadn't brought a fleet. She hadn't brought a weapon. She had brought 40 hours of reading, a plan, a backup plan, a backup to the backup, a credential that technically worked, and a coffee stain she never did manage to remove. Sometimes that was exactly enough.